Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Carissa Carter, Scott Doorley, and Liz Gerber. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for tonight's introductions. Carissa Carter is a designer, geoscientist, and the academic director at the Stanford D.school. She guides the development of the D.school's pedagogy, leads its instructors, and shapes its class offerings. She's the author of The Secret Language of Maps: How to Tell Visual Stories with Data. She teaches design courses on emerging technologies, climate change, and data visualization. And her work on designing with machine learning and blockchain has earned multiple design awards. Scott Doorley is a writer, designer, and the creative director at the Stanford D.school. He has overseen everything from books to workspaces to digital products and initiatives focused on the future of learning and design. He co-wrote Make Space: How to Set the Stage for Creative Collaboration, and his work has been featured in museums from San Jose to Helsinki and in publications such as Architecture and Urbanism and the New York Times. Last, we welcome back one of our favorite humans on the planet, Liz Gerber, who is a professor of mechanical engineering and communication studies at Northwestern University, co-director of the Center for Human-Computer Interaction and Design, co-director of the Delta Lab, and faculty founder of Design for America. And there's about 6 more clauses, but we can't get to them right now. Her research focuses on artificial intelligence and the future of work, and for more than 2 decades, she has consulted widely with for-profit and not-for-profit organizations on innovation and product development. She is also the host of the Technical Difficulties podcast, centered on the stories of female leaders in tech and design. It's excellent. Go watch. And now let's welcome Carissa Carter, Scott Doorley, and Liz Gerber to FAN.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. That was wonderful. What a pleasure, of course, it is to be here. I'd want nothing more. Welcome, Carissa. Welcome to Scott to Chicagoland from California. We know it's a little different out there, and we know you wish you were here. Let's, without further ado, get right into your book. Beautifully covered, Assembling Tomorrow, a guide to designing a thriving future. Here's my question for you. We have a lot of professionals online. We've got a lot of people with kids. I know you all have kids. I'm sure people ask you all the time, why this book now? I want to know why your kids think you wrote this book now. What would they say? What would your teenagers and your grade school kids describe this book to be about?
Wow, that's such a great question, and nobody's asked that question yet, and I appreciate it. I'm gonna build off your little slip of tongue in the beginning when you said assembling tomorrows.
I did, thank you.
Right? And I think like that kind of hits the nail on the head that there is not one tomorrow, but there are so many that are happening in parallel. So I think my kids would say that I wrote this book both to write fiction stories about what those many tomorrows might be, because the fiction throughout the book is part of the fun. And also because they know that my job is one of a designer and I like to make things.
Thank you, Carissa. Scott, what are the teenagers saying? How would they describe your book?
I think they're just complaining that I'm not available enough because I've been doing all this work. but I would say too, I mean, the thing I noticed, and I'm sure everyone who has kids notices this too, when you're a kid, you kind of accept the world as it is, right? I think it's very strange for us, but for them, it's a little more fluid and a little more natural. They get astonished by all these little generative AI tricks that are coming up and things like that. And we have fun with those and get kind of awed and worried about them. But to some degree, they're much more fluid with this change than we are.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to get back to the stories, Chris, in a moment, but I want to first dig in just to give people a sense of what the book is about. You start off with a great Gregory Bateson quote. He's an anthropologist and social scientist, and you start off with his thesis, which is the major problems in the world are a result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. And I'd love you to explain why you started the book with that quote and how that informs the content and the major message of your book.
Yeah, I mean, we're designers. We like to make things, we like to put things out into the world. And if you think about how humans developed, design came before language, right? We were building tools before we were talking about them. So making things is actually core to being human. It's how we put things out into the world. We're amazing at it. And then on the other hand, there's understanding the impacts of the things we've made. And while we are pretty good at that, it seems like we're not super spectacular at that. I'll give you an example. If you think of how nutrition information gets spread, it seems like, every other week that, well, red wine's good for you. No, wait, it's not good for you. And chocolate is, but no, it's not. And, because there are so many variables in the way that the world actually works, even though we're extremely good researchers and we make tons of effort to understand what we're doing, there's just a gigantic gap between our ability to create and our ability to understand the impacts of the things that we create. And we think that's kind of why things feel a little off kilter or are surprising to us, or things happen that we don't expect.
Thank you. You came out with a bold assertion about design, and I may be like other people on this call saying, but I'm not a designer. I don't design curtains. I don't have a good sense of color. I don't know what fonts are best to use. So you have this wonderful line in your book where you say, you kind of describe the breadth of things that people can design. And you say it's beyond products. You can design policies. You can design services. And these were the three I like the best. You can design sermons, production lines, and preschool programs. So I'd love you to expand on that. Carissa, maybe you have some thoughts of how are you thinking about design before we have people check off this call and say, this is not for me. Can you explain how you're thinking about the breadth of what design is and maybe also what it isn't? Are there any boundaries?
Yeah. If you look around at whatever setting you are in right now and you touch something human made, whether that's a pen or a can or a book, right? That was designed. So products are designed. They were created by people, but those products enable any number of experiences to happen. I'll just go with this pen that I'm holding. The experience of writing is a whole thing. If we think of the English language, it moves from left to right across the page. And so if I use this pen that has a little bit of a felt tip to it and I'm a left-hander, that's going to smudge, right? So the products are connected to experiences, are connected to the systems that we get these products in, and we learn to write in school in a certain way. So designing the lesson plans and how the system of learning to write. If you are an educator here, you're designing what happens in your classroom and the programs that happen at your school. So products, experiences, systems, they're all interrelated. There's technologies, both analog and digital technologies. There's plenty of technologies in this pen of how the cap goes on and off and how the ink works and how it has a little clip on it, right? Like technology is designed, and then data is designed too. So this pen is made to be held by an able-bodied person, likely more of an adult size than a child size, right? So, but who is it not created for, right? So the data about like what a adult hand size is went into the creation of it. Data, tech, products, experiences, systems, they're all interrelated. And so if you find yourself working at any one of those levels, and that's where I absolutely agree with what you just underlined, Liz. Yeah, we are all designers in some way. You may not be working on the technology of pens, but if you're helping other people learn to read and write and you're involved in literacy, like you're involved in some way with many different aspects of those layers, and that has a lot of implications. And so we are all designers because we touch those layers.
If I said we're all creators, would that satisfy you?
What's the difference between a creator and a designer to you?
That's my question for you. As I was reading the book, I was wondering what's the difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. Like, I think designer, maybe I'm thinking off the cuff here. I think a designer and a creator could be quite similar in that you could be creating something from scratch, but you could also be taking parts and pieces that exist already and figuring out the order that they go in. If I think of the flow of a school day, you could be thinking of the order that subjects come to pass and redesigning that, but you're not necessarily inventing a school day from scratch. But some days maybe you're doing an entirely different activity. I don't know if one or the other is different. I tend to be pretty fluid with words and not be so rigid and say like, oh, design just means this. I feel like it's just easier to, if you're making things happen, you're a designer, you're a creator.
Okay,
Yeah,
I was thinking, oh, go ahead, Scott,
I was just
please.
going to say, I think there's something about design where it is so much about arranging things such that something else happens, right? So there's some like further afield intent in designing something. Like I'm gonna set up dinner this particular way. It's going to be a potluck rather than a sit down meal because I want everyone to be very relaxed and I want to be, there's something about like the outcome is sort of beyond the thing you're making when you're designing and maybe when you're creating too. But I think sometimes creating is just for creating's sake. Whereas I feel like designing kind of has a purpose a little bit hidden behind there. Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to open it up so everybody feels like they are in this conversation, whether we call it creator or designer, because I think the bigger theme of your work, which is so incredible to me, is this idea, and I'll quote directly from your book. You say, "We have a lot of power, so we may as well put it to use." And I was really moved by that statement because I don't think you were just talking about people who work in tech or people who work in for massive Fortune 500 companies. I think you were really talking about everyone. So I'd love to hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'd love to hear a little more about when you wrote that line. What were you thinking? What was behind that?
Yeah, well, one thing is, oh, sorry, go ahead, Carissa. There's a guy named Eric Liu that I find is really inspiring in this idea of power. So I think he has a book called Becoming America. You can check that out. But
Yes.
his
Around
idea about
citizen democracy, I believe, is
citizen democracy, yeah.
correct, yeah.
And what he talks about is like, we're sometimes uncomfortable with the idea of power, right? Because you think of power, it's described in a situation where it's sort of like top down and it feels sort of evil. When we think about it in a movie, it's like the evil, superhero has some sort of power over people. But power is really just the ability to do something in the world. And we all have that. We are all doing that. If you're a parent, there's some power relationship with your kids. If you're, a designer, there's power relationship with the people who are using the things you're making. If you're a leader, even if you're not a leader, a lot of times in a team, there are very different power dynamics across a team. And the idea is that if we can acknowledge that we are affecting the world and we all are in different ways, then it opens up more of a sense of possibility and more of a sense of responsibility. So again, back to the simplest thing, like, I invite people over for dinner. Well, I have power over, the mood in that room. I have power over how people are going to be introduced to each other. I have power over, the sequence of events. And that's something to do well and to have fun with. And really just talking about design is just saying like, let's be intentional about the things that we put out into the world. And that really can be anything, really anything. I keep bringing it back to a dinner party to just say that like, it's the things we do every day. We're constantly designing, whether or not we're really thinking about it that way.
And so I'm going to ask as a parent, again, I'm thinking adults or designers, but in what ways do you see children designing? And in particular, I'm thinking my daughter's lucky enough to have her own bedroom, and she is 17 and has really taken the design of her bedroom to heart. And I'm curious, in what ways do you see kids designing, changing their environment, using the power that they do have, although often considered as being powerless? In what ways do you see children designing, and in what ways? Yeah, I'll stop there.
That's a good one. I think in my younger son specifically, he's very aware, and he's 9 years old, I'll say, and he is very aware of how he learns and how he focuses best in a way that I never have been in my entire life. And so I see him like, and this partly is what happens in school, and this partly how his own brain works. I see him very conscious of one, how he sets up his own room and his own space and like making sure it's calm because he knows the things that, key him up or down. I feel like that's I don't know, that's a sense of self-awareness to me that I see less in my other child, right? Like, you know how sometimes like people are different, but also the conditions for how they are then designing their environments and lives are different. So I mean, that's one way I notice that within him now. Oh, Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really fantastic question to think about as a parent. You know, in what ways are you giving your kids room to be designers, right? Like to have that sort of power over their own lives. And I know this is a random example, but we bought a particular couch that we made sure our kids could jump on. You know, like it was like, we don't want to be complaining about the jumping on couch thing, right? So that was a decision to say like, well, you guys, and then they jump on it, they climb on it, they flip it over, and they make forts out of it, you know. And I'm, you know, there's just we're giving them permission to be designers there, you know. And I think a lot of parenting is like, what do you want your kids to have kind of control and agency over, and what do you not want? You know, there's certain things I don't want them to be able to grab the keys for the car at age 14 and, you know, head on out. So there are things you want to allow them to have agency over and not. But then the thing is like, I don't know what your relationship with your kids is like, but, you know, a lot of parenting is sort of navigating that who's designing what and who's making the decision here now or not. Even just getting out of the door in the morning is filled with those, I think.
Yeah, yeah. We could go a long way down that one. To bring it back to some of the points in your book, I want to you have a couple tenets that you stand by, and one that I loved is that you talked about is that everything breaks. Like everything wears out. People have good intentions for things not to break, but everything breaks. And so if breaking is inevitable, things are going to break. How do we deal with things that are breaking? And I'm hoping you can share some of your strategies that you offered in the book, and then maybe some concrete illustrations of what happens when things inevitably break.
Yeah, just to underline what we mean by everything breaks, it's like things, yes, things wear out. The systems that we put in place may no longer function. The product or service stops working as intended for one reason or another. But the really important thing is even if something's functioning properly, it may break something else. It may alter something else. So like that's really the main crux of the book too, is that everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
And so even if you know, like social media is a really good example of when social media started, guarantee it wasn't created as, you know, a tool to overthrow governments, right? But the
Or
way
so
that
or Discord, or I mean,
exactly,
yeah, you have a
right?
lovely history of the internet, but I really appreciate it in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like that's a technology that as its use grew, it broke a lot of things. We have a lot of school bullying because of social media. We also have, you know, people that have come together and found each other within their school systems and helped make great change, right? So there's positives and negative consequences to everything that we put into the world. And so when we say everything breaks or it breaks something else, it's about, even if we have the best of intentions, how are we like both practicing predicting what might go wrong from the get-go, and then also figuring out how to shepherd what we make forward into the future.
Can you share the story of the strip malls? You use it throughout the book, and I think it might be an interesting one for people to hear and build on, of how we've responded to that.
Yeah, I grew up in Massachusetts, both Chris and I did. And then moving to the West Coast, you see this, you know, the West Coast just feels so much different. And it's so different because it grew up when the car was coming to be, right? It like grew up in the 40s and 50s through the 70s. And so everything is just, you know, stretched out lower. And so we got really interested in what, you know, what is the story, but where did these things come from? The strip malls and the mini malls and that kind of thing. It turns out there was a guy in Pasadena area in the 1920s, getting frustrated about finding a parking spot. And he was an insurance adjuster, which I don't know if that has anything to do with anything, but it seems like an interesting fact. And it just popped into his head. At that time, all the roads were built like city roads, right? There were no parking lots in front of the buildings. They were behind, or built like an old town in the way that they grew up with horses and things, and you tie the horses up. So there was really nowhere to park in front of the stores. And he just came up with this idea, the simplest idea in the world. I'm going to put the parking lot in front of the store. And then created the first mini market. It was a grocery store. He called it like a drive-in grocery store. And then that just got picked up, and boom, 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 boom. It started in Southern California and then went up to Canada, and just everywhere at the time, because it was such a simple solution to that need for being able to move around a city in a car-centric world. And then, of course, if you've lived in a city that has a lot of strip malls, they have good sides and bads. On the one hand, you'll notice there aren't a lot of big box stores in a strip mall, which is really interesting. It's a lot of mom and pop shops, and frankly, a lot of immigrant owned shops. So it actually becomes like, in the way the Apple App Store was like an easy entry point for people to become, digital entrepreneurs. The mini mall is an easy entry point for immigrants to become entrepreneurs and to own a business. So that's great. On the other hand, getting around a city on foot that has mini malls is really not the most fun experience in the world. And so you have all these frustrations that come out of that. And then you get urban sprawl, and you get further travel with the cars, and you get smog, and you get the 70s in Los Angeles where, the air is so bad they have to start incorporating the restrictions we have on air now that are making it cleaner, right? So it's good, bad, back and forth all over the place. And none of those things were intended, right? It was just, I need a parking spot. And we got, a place to start a small business and this sprawling metropolis. And that's really how things work.
Okay, I want to break that apart because I think that example is so rich, and I think many of us are familiar with that scene. So is there any way we could have anticipated that? Like what would have had to have happened? And could we have stopped this man who really wanted a parking lot in front of a store? So this is about the action. The big first part of your book is kind of about what's happening, what's the complexity, the systems level thinking that we need to have to understand what problems are occurring and the speed at which they're happening, which I want to get to in a moment. But then the second half is like, what do we do about this? And how do we prevent this from the future? So let's go back. I really want to bring us back in time, which you do through beautiful storytelling, and you take us to the future in your book. But let's go back in time. What could we have done differently, and who could have done something differently to kind of steer, if you will, this sprawl in the right direction?
I mean, this gets back into that Gregory Bateson quote, right? Like
okay.
the idea that like we're great at creating and not great at understanding the impacts of what we create. I think there are two things, though, that we can do now that maybe they couldn't have done then, or maybe they didn't know to do then. So one is like, this is a collective action problem, right? Like his responsibility is not the city of Los Angeles. It's the parking lot in front of that store, right? However, of course, like zoning laws can be created that allow collective action to not propagate these things that may or may not be useful. So it really, a lot of systems thinking really gets into two things: policy and feedback loops. So this is the other thing, and we don't want to get too techie or whatever, but when you have the feedback loop, when you're getting the data from the action that you take more quickly, you can adjust more quickly. And so there is a possibility, I think, to shorten the cycles of these feedback loops. So take the idea of social media. Well, we have another story in the book where Carl Sagan goes and talks in front of Congress in the 80s about global warming. And this is the first signs of global warming are coming in. They were coming in early, but by the 70s, it was known to be a problem. This is well over almost 200 years after the beginning of the industrial era. Then we have Frances Haugen, who's known as the Facebook whistleblower, complaining about social media about a decade after it starts, right? So the effects are coming much faster. So you can imagine that we could create, I don't know if it's models, if it's just really the consciousness that we need to be responsible for taking feedback of what we put out into the world more quickly. But we can make these feedback loops shorter now, and they're getting shorter whether we like it or not. So the question is, what can we do to anticipate better? What can we do to look ahead a little bit more? How can we think about the effects that the products of the products that we create, right? How can we start to think about that sooner We call that seeing the unseen.
So I'm gonna push on you a little on this one, Scott, because you have this great, you do a wonderful job drawing from cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, and many different scholars to kind of explain why humans are the way they are. And you have this one part where you're saying, basically whatever information we're going to get, we're either going to make it work with the argument that we believe in, or we're going to dismiss it. So we're not, you have a great line in the book of like, we may be past whether even climate change exists or not it's not a scientific question, it's a persuasion question. You said, I'm paraphrasing your section there, but it just made me wonder if people are so set in the ways that they think the world works, even if we had tighter feedback loops, would it matter?
That's a great point. And this is one of the other reasons why humans have that gap is, there's an idea of motivated reasoning, which is basically a lot of the feelings that you have or a lot of the ideas that you carry are really just a feeling reaction. Like, I want to believe that thing. So then when data comes in, if it conflicts, you're skeptical of it. If it doesn't conflict, you're very accepting of it. So I think that's a thing that we need to get over. And that's true that, there's something that, when we have that data coming in, are we even going to listen to it or not? And I think that's important. But then you can look at, like, when does change happen, right? I think there's some point at which things start to compound to the point that we have no choice but to switch. We have no choice but to move to the next idea. And that, you can think about it.
I love that. I want an example. What are you thinking?
Like, my thinking on this is like, it's called, in my head, it's the drama problem, right? So like, let's say you're watching a movie. A perfect example is a series, right? Okay. Like a Netflix series. Season 1, it's kind of normal. Season 2, it's getting a little more dramatic. By season 3, it's soap opera territory. It's like somehow someone came back from the dead and this thing and did it, because it has to keep getting more dramatic, right? But then it reaches a point where, like, the dramatic is so absurd that it just doesn't make sense anymore. And you have to step back and reset, and people start turning it off, or they just kind of like relax the storylines, or they move on to like, oh, we're going to do a prequel now because this, the 4th sequel is just too much. So that's an example in like entertainment. I think we're seeing it in climate change. I really do feel that there are a lot of people who don't believe this is happening, but there's some point where it's like, well, the feedback loop is so strong that it's really just hard to fit in your story anymore, that it's not happening, and you really have to react to it. And I think we're at a tipping point there pretty soon, but who knows? Maybe I don't know if that's optimism or what that is, but.
Well, I want to tell you, reading your book, I felt very optimistic. I felt like it was like a cheerleading for the future and changing the future, and just pointing out some, potential spots where I may trip, and we want to be mindful of. And so I'm very intrigued by this idea of closing the feedback loop, making it faster. You also had another point, and I'm going to look to Carissa to answer this, because one of the joys of reading this book is knowing your background as a filmmaker, Scott, and as a geologist, Carissa. I was trying to guess, of course, who wrote what part. I know you wrote the whole thing together, but this is the line I pegged with you, Carissa. And there was a quote from Vera Rubin, who is an astronomer, and I'm going to read it and ask you to expand on it because I thought it was beautiful, which is, Vera wrote, "We became astronomers thinking we were studying the universe, and now we learn that we are just studying the 5 or 10% that is luminous." And so first, just tell me, did you come up with that? Did you find that quote, or was that Scott? And then second, if I'm wrong, that's okay. And then second, what does it mean? Why'd you pull that out?
So you're privy to something really special, Liz, and everybody on this call, because Scott and I vowed never to tell. Never to tell. But I'll tell you, I did find that quote. Yes. So you're right there. And I actually specifically went looking for it because I, as a geologist, work for her son, David Rubin, who is a world-renowned sedimentologist. So how sand moves, and in many aspects is a real father figure in the processes that shape our landscape. And I knew about Vera and her work. She was really the first person to ever discover dark matter. Okay, so she's like way ahead of her time as a female scientist as well. So somebody that I had my eye on for a while. And the reality though of that quote of like the fact that we are only seeing the tiny fraction of our world that is luminous, right? That's wild. That like this idea that our own experience is really just our own experience. It ties with this other concept in the book that comes up in a few different ways, but one of them is around the idea of sensory perception. And let me, since we're telling things, I'll say that Scott brought this concept to the book of the Umwelt, Jacob von Uxkel, right? Which is the idea that every single species has its way of sensing the world. So we humans, we see in the visible spectrum and we can taste and we can hear, etc. We have this kind of sensory perception, and butterflies taste with their feet, and elephants can hear vibration and use that as ways to communicate and know what's where. And even going beyond that, I've been really nerding out on the plant world recently, and Zoe Schlanger's book The Light Eaters is like a must read if you want to be blown away by how plants communicate and act as organisms that interact with insects in the soil, right? It is just wild how much the natural world knows and perceives. Now, each one of us as humans is that way too. So, we've all been in arguments with somebody else and you believe you're right. And then through dialogue, maybe you can understand that there was another perspective too. One way that I like to experiment with this is really easy for any one of us to do. Is like we have this assumption that our way is the way, right? And that like the way that the world exists is our way. Is you think about like just walking down the street in your neighborhood, right? Or your walk to work, your walk to school. If you go a different way, you're much more in tune with what's happening, right? Because like you don't automatically know you need to stop at this block because the cars come quickly here, and that like you're gonna smell this scent from the one restaurant that you always pass by. The minute you take a different path, you focus more, right? Because you don't want to mess up, or it's like the same as traveling when you're like more in tune when you're in a different environment. So like it's just simple things like that you can do to remind yourself that your way isn't the only slice of reality. And like that kind of thing, any one of us can do at any moment.
So how does that, first of all, I just want to stop and say, I was reading the line about feet, tasting through feet when I was in a dirty subway and literally just like convulsed. So thank you for sharing that. That was perfect timing of that stat. Didn't know about that. Glad I don't taste with my feet. Second, how does this relate to assembling the future? Like realizing how little we know, essentially, that we're only looking at some small percentage and other people have other mental models. How do we not just feel overwhelmed by that and think, how in the world can I understand, even what people are beginning to think? So help me understand how we can use that as empowerment for designing or assembling a better tomorrow.
Well, I mean, a lot of disciplines are based on this knowledge, right? So if you take science completely based on figuring out what I don't know. So it takes ignorance as a complete given. Mm-hmm. And really, like there's something interesting about that. There's more to know. I have things to figure out. If I create something, let's see what happens. And we talked about kids. Mm-hmm. Kids this is their job, right? Young kids in particular, their job is to put something into the world and see what happens. And they're trying to figure out like, oh, if I do this, how does that work? They're testing their limits. That's, I think, how we all need to be operating. And somehow along the line, we kind of lost that. And I'm not saying like, oh, we have to be children at heart. What I'm saying is like, there's joy in curiosity. There's joy in figuring things out. There's, wonder in ignorance. And I think it doesn't have to necessarily, it can feel sort of like, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. We don't know. We're never going to know. We're never going to figure it out. I get that it's totally overwhelming. But at the same time, it's like, it's totally exciting. There's so much to do. But we can operate in just a very slightly different way, which is like, if you're operating in ignorance, if you're operating in not knowing, you just have to behave a little differently. Like, think, I had this one time my power went out the other night, right? And when my power goes out in my house, it is pitch dark. Like, you can't see a thing. And so I get up and, suddenly I'm navigating the room with my hands, and it's a totally different feeling. And I have to slow down. And all the things that I probably do totally subconsciously now are right in the front of my consciousness. And to be honest, it was, a little creepy, but it also like kind of got me to like think about my house in a different way. When we told our publicist about this, idea of being able to see beyond the edges of your ignorance, she talked about how she worked with a man who walked every single street in New York City and wrote a book about it. I can't remember his name. And what he found out in talking to New Yorkers is many of them had never seen the back of their block, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they had never just gone around to the other side of the block because, the commute to work was the opposite direction. So they always went that way, or the restaurants were that way. So there was, literally had never been around the block. And I just think there's excitement in that. We have to be careful. We have to be a little more experimental and sort of probing. And we can sort of trade confidence for curiosity. It feels scary to let go of confidence, but I don't think the future really wants our confidence. What it needs is our curiosity, I think.
It needs our inspiration too, right? Like what we need to be like filling our heads with possibility. And that's not always easy because of how unsettling it is right now. Right. It can really, really feel like the world is happening to us.
Right.
But there are some shifts to regain that agency.
Okay, so yeah, I want to play with that tension a little more and get you all use the word make believe, which I'm a big fan of make believe, but I know many people don't. They think it's trivial. They think it's not worth your time. When something's on fire, why are you imagining what if the world were different? So can you talk a little bit about the power of make believe, and as well as like how we use that when things feel like they're literally blowing up in front of us, like the urgency of dealing with reality, and the benefits of staying in a make-believe place, or maybe being both at the same time. I'd love to hear. I also want to call out Lonnie found that book, because of course Lonnie does that kind of thing. She figured out the book that you didn't know the name for. So that's the kind of thing that, thank you.
Oh my gosh, there it is.
She's amazing. Just amazing.
Yes.
So if you just want to like describe like a three words of a book, she'll probably figure it out. But anyway, I'm gonna go back to make believe. Yeah. So what is the power of make believe, and then how do we hold that with the tension of like, I just need to fix the problem that's in front of me. What's really happening right now?
I was having a great conversation, sorry, with one of our colleagues, Lisa K. Solomon, who's going to be here in a few days, I think, or next week. Yeah. And she thinks a lot about the future. She's been working in this field for 20 years. And what she mentioned, which just really landed for me, is that if you're not imagining what's to come, somebody else is doing it for you, right? Whether it's the politicians or the people who are, doomsayers, or it's even just the sci-fi movies, and so it is really important to be able to imagine what's possible, right? Because otherwise we're just going to kind of accept whoever is creating the story, right? Because it fits, or we don't have time to think about it, or we're too scared to really imagine beyond that. Because really, like, that's where the future begins, is in your imagination. Sorry, I cut you off there, Carissa.
No, that's great. Absolutely everything is imagined before it's created. Full stop. That's all there is, right? You have to dream it before you can make it.
But let's sort of imagine and dream. Like, does it have to be grounded in reality, or can it be like in my classes? Sometimes I have to tell students just to get warmed up into imagination. I have to say, okay, money is no object, gravity doesn't exist, I have to take away all the constraints they deal with every day to get them thinking about alternatives. And so I guess maybe my question is, what defines imagination? Like, is imagination just imagining what I'm going to do an hour after this conversation? Or is it, ridding the world of all the constraints that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, money, politics, etc. So like how much is taken away, I guess is my question.
I mean, both can be really useful depending on the context you're in. You're absolutely right. I think that one thing that we like to do in this book in particular that continues to come up in classes ever since we did it in this book is trying on moments in the future through your imagination. Yeah. So when we have short stories in this book, as we talked about before, that take us slightly into the near future, 5, maybe 10, 20 years. And they're not the wild gravity doesn't exist anymore type future, but really they take a thread of what we see happening today and say, okay, let's say that comes to pass. What's a moment like? What's a conversation you might be having? What's a dynamic that you now need to wrestle with? And by imagining the full moment, you start to realize that like, oh, there's some interpersonal dynamics that are related to bringing back your dead mother, as in one of the stories that Scott crafted.
I'm hoping can you expand on one of the stories? That one I thought was fascinating as a woman with an older mother and a sister. Can you explain, just give an example of what one of these stories are about and how you use them to explain the ideas you were getting across? So can you briefly, any story would work, but I love
so that one, I'll just follow that thread. And Scott wrote this story. It's about 2 siblings who are having an argument, and they're having this argument because it is now possible to resurrect their deceased mother, and they're arguing about, which version of her they want to coexist with, because, one, like, we all have different relationships. If you have a sibling with your parent, that we all have different relationships. And so in this world that's talked about in this story, that we're able to do this and resurrect those parents, that's a new conversation that you may need to have, right? That is something that may come to pass. And the really fascinating thing about this story is that when that was written, that wasn't really a thing. And now there's multiple services that will actually take all of your media of a deceased loved one and craft an AI for you. So it's a great example of like, that technology is happening. Like what conversation, what type of interpersonal moments does it bring out, as well as the like conversation of, is this the tech that we want in our lives?
Yeah. So just from a storytelling perspective, I found myself, I've never read any book like this, first of all, so thank you. It was a blend of storytelling and then design philosophy, as well as a guidebook. I mean, it was a mashup of a lot of different things, which was so delightful to read because I never got bored. I was never bored because there was a story, and then there was a guide, and then there was practical advice. It was a little disorienting at first, but once I got the rhythm, I loved it. There's also gorgeous, like it looks like a coffee table book. I mean, the images in it are also gorgeous. So it defies all norms of books that I've read. And I just, huge kudos to you for pulling that together in that way. So thank you for including those stories. I absolutely loved them. It also made me realize how stoic we've been about the form of books. Like, why does a book have to have just one modality? It was beautiful. I think it was a beautiful illustration maybe of some of the ideas that you're coming across. And I wonder what kind of impact this will have on future book writers of thinking about what can go into a book. But anyway, so going back to some of the content in it, so I think it was beautifully arranged. I want to get back to a topic we haven't touched on yet with our little time we have left, which is around the speed of change. So you, again, quote, I think you win the award for quoting the most diverse set of thinkers. You quote Lenin, one of my favorite quotes from Lenin, which is, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are moments when decades happen. And so one of the themes throughout the book is that things are changing quickly. So I'd love to hand it over to you, and maybe you can speak a little bit to like why this book now, and what is it about the rate of technology change that really inspired you?
Yeah, there's so many ways to look at this, and we were talking in front of a group of entrepreneurs from New Zealand, and we were talking about we call synthetic biology artificial evolution to kind of mirror artificial intelligence. And what we're trying to do is call attention to the fact that like this is a very different way of working. And one of the people who was a farmer was like, isn't this just breeding? We've been breeding forever, right? This is just breeding. It's just faster breeding, right? And just faster really kind of caught my attention. You know, I could run into a car going 1 mile an hour in the parking lot on my bike, or I could get hit by that same car going 100 miles an hour on the road. Which do I want? Just faster is enough. You know, just speeding things up is different. And why is that so different? Well, it's different because the rate of change speeds up and we're not prepared for it. So even as Carissa was talking about this story that we wrote, when we wrote the story, which was 3 years ago, probably when we started it, this felt like it was 10 years away. The idea that you could resurrect, yeah, you could resurrect a loved one's personality. We were like, oh, that's it. You could see it coming, but you're like, this is decades away.
Yeah.
By the time we published the book, it was there, multiple. And then you're asking the questions, you know, this argument between the siblings, like, how do we negotiate which version of our mother we want? Right? That is just like not even a question that has occurred because we've only had one version up until now. Right. And so that speed and that amount of change, we call technology now emerging tech.
Yeah.
Why? Like, why don't we just call it tech? We always called it tech or new tech. Why are we calling it emerging tech? And it's because it's coming faster and because it's getting stranger, right? Like AI, generative AI is strange, right? Like it returns things that you don't expect. It's kind of, you can't believe it. It does it. And we're going to see that with synthetic biology or artificial evolution too, right? So just the emerging part, just the speed part is a fundamental change. And, you know, we got to come to grips with that. And a lot of it is just recognizing that it feels strange. It feels weird. And like being okay with that, and then looking at, well, what are the new opportunities this is bringing up? You know, can you get a little bit ahead of it? Can you anticipate a little bit? Like, and that's why the fiction was really helpful. It allows you to think a little bit, 2-3 steps ahead. Well, if that happens, then what happens? And then what happens after that? And that's where we're going to get in 2 years, you know?
And Scott, oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to build and say the other layer on top of the speed getting faster is that those technological materials that we call emerging tech are invisible to the naked eye, right? In like, if you have a piece of paper, like, you know, all of us know that it folds and you can make a little paper airplane, and like I crumple it and you know I've torn it. You could set this on fire and like know that it has been combusted, right? Because we can see the materials of making. Wood, metal, you know, plastics, these things that even if you don't know how to weld, you have a sense for that metal can support a certain amount of weight, right? Because we can see the materials around us and the effects they have, and we can see when they're broken. Now, with these emerging tech materials like AI, Gen AI, like the gene editing, the synthetic biology, and artificial evolution, not only are they propagating really quickly, but because we can't see them, most of us have no idea how they're actually coded. All we see is the effects when something has happened. And that's just this added spinning that creates, you know, what we call it a runaway design world, which is both the speed increasing, but also the fact that you can no longer really see the materials we're working with.
So we can't see them.
Mm-hmm.
And Scott says we got to just come to grips and speed up. Is that possible? Can we speed up?
I don't know if I think I'm saying we need to come to grips with the fact that things are speeding up.
Okay.
And I do so I don't know that, can our brains work faster than they do? Probably to a minor degree if we, accentuate them in one way or another, but then we're losing things by accentuating them. So I think in that idea of like, well, we can create faster than we can understand. We've got really two options. We can create slower or understand quicker. And I think we're probably going to need both. And right now, there's not like a creating slower movement going on. So we might have to speed up understanding. And so that should be, though, I think that should be a really urgent thing to do. So as an example, we take for granted that technology development goes slower than legislation, as an example. Well, does it have to? Could legislation go faster? Why couldn't legislation go faster? Now you'll say, oh, bottlenecks in Congress and, just polarization. And of course, there are many things running against that. But, there could be different ways to write laws that look 3 steps ahead, write laws for things that haven't happened yet. Then you say, well, oh man, that sounds kind of scary. We could start to be legislating, well, then maybe we need to have adaptive laws, right? Like easy ways to change them when we figure out we're wrong. And so like, this is what we're trying to say is like, if we agree that we're in ignorance, if we agree that things are moving quickly, it's not that we need to maybe move more quickly. We need to adapt to it. We need to think differently, like really think differently about how we're putting things out into the world and what the criteria is for making, right? So we might need to be speculative and we might need to be adaptive about everything that we do, which we're not totally doing right now, except in the tech world, right? The tech world is very speculative and very adaptive. And that's why it's kind of running away a little bit, right? So we one way to do it is to sort of apply those to other spaces. Is that going to be a perfect world? I don't know. Yeah.
Speculative law. I can already see it as a new field. Carissa, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I think the way that the part of this always feels like we can allow ourselves to spin out, but I really love the mantra that you don't have to know the code, you do need to know what that code can do. Yes. So for anybody on here that doesn't speak algorithm, that's me, right? I don't know how all this Gen AI is coded on the backside, etc. I have a sense for how it might be working. Our job really is to ask questions of the people that are using it in our organizations. Why are you using it? What do you think it does? Of the technologists in our lives, in our workplaces, like, how is this working? How is it making decisions? Of how we use it, right? One thing we like to do with students is to what we call try on different algorithms in data sets. And what this involves is saying like, okay, I wonder if I use, let's say, a certain kind of machine learning algorithm, like a classification algorithm that says like, all things with noses are humans, or that's what a classification algorithm is. If you are familiar with like is that a blueberry muffin or a chihuahua? And the machine is choosing which one it is. It's like, it's classifying it in one way or another. So if I use a classification algorithm and this data set that I have about all these students who came to school with lunch today or not, or who brings lunch on what days and purchases lunch or gets a free or reduced lunch. I wonder what I might discover, right? So you're trying on like, oh, would I be classifying, like, what is this the right type of data? What would I learn if I'm trying to make a decision? Is this a student who needs longer at lunch? Is this a student who needs more support outside of the classroom? Like when you mix data that you have and you understand what it comes from with the way that technologists think about sorting it and searching it, you start to try on the effects that using that type of technology does. The more that all of us can start to do that and be part of the conversation, the more literate we're going to be in these emerging technologies. And that's possible. That is very accessible.
My last question before Lonnie takes over is, I have the privilege of knowing that one of the two of you used to at least have gymnast rings, like legit gymnast rings in your living room. Like it was next to the couch. And so my question is, in what way do we all need those rings in our house to think in the future, or are we going to be okay if we just have a couch, you know, if we have a more traditional home? So that's my last question for whoever would like to answer that question.
That was me.
I think the person that has the rings should answer.
Yeah, also the person who created couches for my kids to jump on. And that was my partner's idea. And, you know, I think that was doing what you're saying it was doing. I think it's really important. And actually, a lot of the creativity tests, you know, they give you a brick. Yeah. What can you do with this brick? And not only what can you do with it, but what very different ways can you use it? So not just as a doorstop and a paperweight, but as a doorstop, a paperweight, and some sort of catapult, and then, you know, some stamping mechanism, you know, all the very different ways. I think there is something really important about being able to look at something normal and seeing the opportunities in it. So my partner saw our living room, and instead of seeing like, oh, there's a space for two couches, she said, there's a beam that we can screw, you know, we can screw gymnastics rings into, you know. And it was the same thing, same living room. It's just looking at the beam and saying like, oh, there's something different we could do with that beam. And as soon as you do that, I think this is the other thing that I'm hopeful about. As soon as you see that, and as soon as you react to it, then it's available to everybody else, right? And then suddenly it's like, well, every beam can now become gymnastics rings if you want it, you know? And I think that's really important, is that we find ways to sort of heal things and solve these problems, and we share them. And that's where the change can really happen.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Carissa. Lonnie?
Thank you.
Scott, Carissa, Liz, thank you for just a very thought-provoking conversation. I feel like I have about 16 questions I've been jotting down for after hours, so I can't wait to get there and pose at least one of them to you. Liz, as always, you are so prepared and thoughtful and insightful. You have a key quality that I wish I could clone for all fan interviewers, which is you listen to the answer, and then sometimes that means you have a new question. And you're not just going to question number 4 on your sheet of paper. We very much appreciate that. It's a very perfect way to approach. I want to remind folks, we're doing after hours with Carissa and Liz and Scott, all at after hours. Come to after hours. This book, as you've been hearing, is incredible. Get a copy from our partner bookseller, The Bookstall. There is so much in it. It's great to browse through. It's great to pick up and read sections. Buy a copy from the bookstall. We've been putting the links in chat. In your email receipt from the store is the link to register for after hours. So come hang out, come ask your own questions, ask these folks, what is this thing called D.school? Why do they call it D.school? What does that mean? What is the future of design? I want to talk about the whole series of books. This is actually a capstone book of a whole series of books. Fan has hosted 3 other authors in this series. I want to talk a little bit about that. Come bring your design questions. Come bring your anxiety about the future. Come bring whatever you want to bring. We're at 8 o'clock. We're going to shut down right now. We will give these nice folks a 5-minute break before we open up after hours. Come hang out with us and ask your own questions. And thank you both for just a beautiful, lovely, lovely, thought-provoking conversation. I'm very grateful. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight.